Just hours after signing my divorce papers, I flew to Louisiana with my 2 children. Meanwhile, my ex-husband and his wealthy family gathered at a VIP maternity clinic to hear the results of his mistress's ultrasound. But the doctor's next words left them all completely speechless. My name is Maya. I am 34 years old, and for a decade I played the quiet and submissive wife to a man who truly believed his bloodline made him a king. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair inside the mahogany-paneled conference room of Atlanta's most expensive family law firm. The air conditioning hummed a low and freezing note, matching the icy atmosphere radiating from the other side of the massive glass table. Vivian Pierce, my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law, sat with her posture entirely rigid. She was 62 years old and dressed impeccably in a tailored St. John knit suit, her signature pearls resting against her collarbone. She looked at me with a level of disdain that she usually reserved for dirt on her shoe. With a manicured hand, she pushed the thick stack of divorce settlement papers across the smooth glass surface toward me. The gold bracelets on her wrist clinked together, breaking the suffocating silence of the room. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she took in my simple linen suit. "You are making a massive mistake, Maya," Vivian said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "Rejecting the alimony Darius is generously offering is nothing but fake pride from a Louisiana swamp girl trying to act like she belongs in a Spellman legacy family. You think this makes you look strong, but it only highlights your complete lack of breeding. We brought you into Atlanta high society, we gave you the Pierce name, and this is how you repay us. By throwing a tantrum and tearing a prominent black family apart just because my son had a momentary lapse in judgment." I did not blink. I simply looked at her, letting her words hang in the freezing air. Beside her sat Darius, my husband of 10 years. At 36, he possessed the kind of arrogant good looks that allowed him to fail upward his entire life. He adjusted the cuffs of his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit and let out a loud, mocking sigh. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide as if he owned the entire building. "Listen to my mother, Maya," Darius said, his tone laced with heavy sarcasm. "You are throwing away a 10-year marriage over nothing." I slipped up. It happens to powerful men. Chloe is 24 years old and she was my secretary. It meant absolutely nothing until she got pregnant. But I am a vice president at a top-tier private equity firm. I bring home the real money. I provide the lifestyle you have been enjoying for the past decade. If you sign those papers and reject the financial support I am legally required to offer, you will have absolutely nothing. Darius leaned closer, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "I am willing to let you keep the beat-up Honda Accord so you can drive Trey and Zuri back to whatever ghetto you came from in Louisiana. But do not expect a single dime from the Pierce family trust. You want to walk away from my protection, then you walk away with empty pockets. You should be begging me to keep you in this family. Instead, you are acting like you have options. You have no options, Maya. You have been a stay-at-home mother for 10 years. You have zero income and zero power." The family lawyer, a balding man named Mr. Sterling, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked down at his notes, clearly aware of the brutal emotional abuse happening right in front of him. But he was paid far too much by the Pierce family to ever intervene. He cleared his throat gently and pointed to the bottom line of the final page. "Mrs. Pierce, if you waive your right to alimony and spousal support, the court will finalize the dissolution of marriage today," Mr. Sterling explained quietly. "You are entirely sure you want to proceed without financial compensation?" Vivian scoffed loudly before I could answer. "Of course she is going to sign it. She thinks she is making a grand statement. She thinks she is proving that she does not need our generational wealth. Let her sign it, Darius. Let her go back to the swamps. She never fit our aesthetic anyway. I always told you that you should have married someone from Jack and Jill. Someone with the right background. Someone with light skin and good hair like Chloe. Chloe understands how to treat a Pierce man. Chloe understands legacy." Every word they spoke was designed to break my spirit. For 10 years they had gaslighted me, manipulated me, and isolated me from my own roots. They mocked my Louisiana heritage, calling my family uneducated and poor. They flaunted their country club memberships and their Greek letter organization badges as if those things made them superior human beings. Darius believed his infidelity was just a minor inconvenience that I was supposed to swallow for the sake of the family image. He actually expected me to stay home, raise our two children, and smile for the cameras while he moved his pregnant mistress into a luxury condo across town. I looked down at the divorce papers. The stark black ink printed on heavy bond paper represented the end of a decade of silent suffering. I did not cry. I did not yell. I did not give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I knew exactly who Darius was. I knew his vice president title was entirely ceremonial, given to him only because his family had connections. I knew the Pierce family logistics company was not the financial fortress they pretended it was. But most importantly, I knew exactly who I was. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my Mont Blanc pen. The heavy weight of the metal felt grounding in my hand. I uncapped it smoothly. "Maya, do not be an idiot," Darius warned, his voice taking on a threatening edge. "You sign that, and you are dead to Atlanta. You will never set foot in our social circles again." I ignored him completely. I pressed the tip of the pen to the signature line and signed my name with bold, deliberate strokes. I flipped to the next page and signed again. I initialed the waivers. I signed the child custody agreements, which granted us joint custody, but legally allowed me to relocate the children to Louisiana, since Darius explicitly refused to pay for their Atlanta private schools moving forward. I signed away every single claim to the Pierce family estate. When I placed the pen down, the loud click echoed sharply in the silent room. I slid the thick stack of papers across the glass table toward Mr. Sterling. "It is done," I said, my voice calm, steady, and completely devoid of the fear they so desperately wanted to see. "I am officially no longer a Pierce." Vivian let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. "Good riddance," she sneered, adjusting her pearls. "Enjoy your miserable life, Maya. Do not come crying to my son when you cannot afford to feed your children." I watched the ink dry on the final page of the divorce decree. The absolute certainty of my freedom settled deep into my bones. Vivian and Darius were already standing up, buttoning their expensive jackets, preparing to leave me sitting there in my supposed defeat. Darius reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys, tossing them playfully in the air. "Well, I have a busy afternoon," Darius said, looking at his Rolex. "I have to pick up Chloe and my mother. We are taking the Range Rover to the VIP maternity clinic. We get to find out the gender of my new baby today. A baby from a woman who actually respects me." I remained seated. I slowly reached down into my Telfar shopping bag. My fingers bypassed my wallet and found the single crisp sheet of paper I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the glass table. It featured a bright red corporate seal stamped at the top. I pushed it gently across the table until it rested directly in front of Darius. "Before you leave, Darius, you might want to read that," I said, my voice remaining perfectly even. Darius frowned, his arrogant expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He leaned over and picked up the paper. Vivian stopped near the door, turning back with a look of supreme irritation. "What is this nonsense, Maya?" Darius demanded, scanning the dense legal text. "Are you trying to sue me for something else? I just told you, you get nothing." "Read the header, Darius," I instructed calmly. He narrowed his eyes and read aloud. "Notice of immediate asset repossession, issued by Crescent Heritage Holdings, LLC." He let out a loud, barking laugh. "What the hell is Crescent Heritage Holdings? And what does this have to do with me?" "It has everything to do with you," I replied, finally standing up from my chair. I smoothed down the front of my linen blazer and met his gaze directly. "You see, Darius, you have spent the last 10 years convinced that you were the sole provider of our household. You believed your private equity salary was funding our lifestyle. But your salary barely covered your expensive tailored suits and your endless golf club fees." Vivian marched back toward the table, her face flushing red. "How dare you speak to him that way? My son is a highly successful executive. Your son is a glorified mascot." I corrected her, my tone remaining icy and polite. "Crescent Heritage Holdings is a private real estate and investment trust based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was founded by my great-grandfather and expanded by my father. And as of 5 years ago, I am the sole controlling director and primary shareholder of that company. Darius froze. The color began to drain from his face as his eyes darted rapidly across the paper in his hands. That $150,000 Range Rover autobiography you drove to this office today? I continued, taking a slow step toward him. It is not a company car from your private equity firm. Your firm denied your request for a luxury vehicle allowance 3 years ago because your portfolio performance was abysmal. You threw a massive tantrum at home about how embarrassing it would be to drive your old sedan to the country club. So I bought the Range Rover, I registered it under Crescent Heritage Holdings, and I leased it to you for exactly $1 a month to protect your fragile, pathetic ego. Darius opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hands began to tremble slightly, causing the heavy paper to shake. Now that our marriage is legally dissolved, the lease agreement is officially terminated, I stated, pointing firmly at the document. That piece of paper is a legal repossession order. You will place the keys to my vehicle on this table right now. If you attempt to drive that car out of the parking garage, I will immediately call the Atlanta Police Department and report the vehicle as stolen. And we both know how much the Pierce family hates public scandals. Vivian gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. You are lying! She shrieked, her voice losing all its previous elegant composure. You do not have that kind of money. You are a nobody from the swamps. I turned my gaze to Vivian. The swamps you constantly mock happen to sit on top of some of the most valuable commercial real estate in the southern United States. I smiled, a small, terrifyingly calm smile. I let you pay for dinner sometimes just to make you feel superior, Vivian. But I could buy and sell your entire logistics company with my quarterly dividends. Darius looked completely shattered. The smug, arrogant vice president who had walked into the room 10 minutes ago was entirely gone. His chest heaved as he struggled to process the destruction of his reality. He looked at the keys in his hand, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and absolute panic. You played me, Darius whispered, his voice cracking. You sat there for 10 years and let me think I was taking care of you. I let you think you were a man? I corrected him sharply. But real men do not sleep with their secretaries and then try to leave their children with nothing. Put the keys on the table, Darius. I will not ask you a second time. Darius gritted his teeth. A thick vein pulsed violently on the side of his forehead. He raised his hand as if he wanted to throw the keys at my face, but my steady, unflinching glare stopped him. He knew I was not bluffing. He knew I would have him arrested in front of his precious colleagues. With a loud, humiliated groan, he slammed the heavy key fob down onto the glass table. The metal scratched sharply against the surface. I picked up the keys and dropped them casually into my Telfar bag. I looked at the two of them one last time, taking a mental photograph of their absolute defeat. Enjoy your Uber ride, I said softly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the conference room. I did not look back. I strode down the long carpeted hallway of the law firm, feeling lighter with every single step. The elevator doors opened immediately, and I rode down to the ground floor in complete silence. When I pushed through the heavy revolving doors of the lobby, the thick, humid heat of the Atlanta afternoon hit my face. Waiting directly at the curb was a pristine jet-black Maybach. My personal driver, Marcus, stepped out immediately and opened the rear door for me. Inside the spacious, climate-controlled cabin, my two beautiful children, Trey and Zuri, were watching a movie on the rear entertainment screens. Hey, Mommy! Zuri smiled brightly as I slid into the leather seat beside her. Are we going to Louisiana now? Yes, baby. I smiled, pulling her into a tight hug. We are going home. Marcus closed the door and slid into the driver's seat. To the private terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson, Ms. Jackson, he asked respectfully. Yes, Marcus, I replied, resting my head against the cool leather. Let us go. As the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, I glanced out the tinted window. Standing on the hot concrete outside the office building, Darius was furiously tapping on his phone, trying to summon an Uber. Vivian stood next to him, her face twisted in rage, screaming at him while swatting at the humid air. Darius pressed his phone to his ear, his face twisted in a vicious scowl. Through the glass, I could practically hear his desperate, angry voice as he called his mother. "Let her walk!" Darius spat into the phone, kicking the curb with his expensive Italian leather shoe. "Once we get to the VIP clinic today and confirm my son's gender, we are cutting her completely out of the Pierce legacy. She is going to beg to come back to us. Just wait." I smiled, turning my attention back to my children as the car sped toward the airport. Darius thought his day could not possibly get any worse. He had no idea that the real destruction of the Pierce family was just about to begin. 10 miles away from the airport, the Atlanta Maternal Fetal Medicine Center stood as a shining monument to medical exclusivity. This was not a standard hospital clinic. It was a fortress of marble and glass designed specifically for the city's ultra-wealthy elite. The private waiting suite reserved exclusively for the Pierce family felt less like a doctor's office and more like a velvet-lined throne room at a five-star luxury resort. Gold sconces cast a warm, flattering glow against textured silk wallpaper. A catered spread of artisan pastries, fresh fruit, and sparkling mineral water sat completely untouched on a sprawling mahogany credenza. Darius stormed into the suite, pulling sharply at the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit. His jaw was clenched so tightly, a visible muscle ticked near his temple. He had managed to secure a premium rideshare after his humiliating exit from the law firm, but the absolute shock of losing his $150,000 Range Rover was still burning a hole straight through his ego. He needed validation. He needed his family to remind him that he was a king, especially after a Louisiana swamp girl had just stripped him of his armor in front of his own attorney. Vivian Pierce already sat in the center of the plush, curved velvet sofa holding court exactly the way she had her entire adult life. She had seamlessly transitioned from the aggressive rage she displayed in the law firm parking lot back into her role as the untouchable matriarch of a dynasty. She smoothed down the skirt of her St. John knit suit, her posture rigid and demanding respect. Her signature pearls rested perfectly against her collarbone. Seated directly next to Vivian was Chloe. At 24 years old, Chloe possessed the exact kind of polished superficial beauty that looked perfect in country club newsletters. She wore a bespoke cream-colored maternity dress that hugged her subtly rounding stomach, resting one perfectly manicured hand protectively over her bump. She played the role of the demure, highly bred woman to absolute perfection, batting her eyelashes and smiling softly whenever Vivian spoke. Pacing the length of the expansive private suite was Jada Pierce, Washington Darius's 33-year-old sister. Jada was draped head to toe in her signature sorority colors, her designer heels clicking a sharp, aggressive rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. She carried a Birkin bag on her arm like a weapon and wore an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. In the far corner of the suite, sitting in a heavy wingback chair, was Terrence Washington. At 35, Jada's husband was a commercial real estate broker, known for wearing overly flashy suits and carrying an air of desperate, slick ambition. Today, however, Terrence looked unusually tense. He kept shifting his weight, tugging nervously at his silk collar and aggressively avoiding eye contact with Darius. While the rest of the Pierce family treated this ultrasound appointment like a royal coronation, Terrence looked like a man waiting for a trap door to open beneath his feet. His leg bounced uncontrollably against the chair, his eyes darting frantically between his furious wife, his arrogant brother-in-law, and the woman carrying what he secretly prayed was not his child. The sterile smell of the clinic mixed with the heavy, expensive perfumes in the room was making him physically nauseous. Jada stopped her pacing and checked her diamond-encrusted Cartier watch, letting out a sharp, malicious laugh that echoed loudly through the quiet room. "I just checked the current flight schedules out of Hartsfield-Jackson," Jada announced, her voice dripping with sheer condescension. "The only flights heading toward that muddy swamp Maya calls a hometown are commercial economy flights. Can you even imagine it?" She flipped her hair over her shoulder, sneering at the very thought. Maya dragging my nephews through Terminal B like commoners fighting for overhead bin space, probably sitting next to the restrooms. I honestly cannot believe Trey and Zuri are being subjected to that kind of working-class poverty. She never understood how to navigate our world. She could not even get into a proper HBCU legacy program. She is probably sitting at the gate right now, crying over a cheap cup of coffee, realizing she just threw away a winning lottery ticket. Darius leaned against the marble credenza, crossing his arms over his chest. He desperately needed this narrative. It acted as a salve on the massive wound Maya had just inflicted. Let the woman experience brutal reality for the first time in 10 years. Darius sneered, forcing a tight, arrogant smile. I provided a bubble of absolute unbothered luxury for her. She lived in a multi-million-dollar estate in Buckhead. She swiped my platinum cards without a second thought. She attended exclusive galas and summered with us in Martha's Vineyard when she never would have been invited without my last name opening the doors. If she wants to play the independent victim and reject my generous alimony, she can enjoy the harsh consequences. Jada laughed again, a cruel, high-pitched sound. Exactly. She tried to play the role of a high society wife, but underneath those designer dresses you bought her, she was always just a regular, uneducated girl who got lucky. She is going to be begging to come back the minute she realizes the Louisiana humidity ruins whatever cheap, off-the-rack clothes she can afford now. You should have fought harder for primary custody, Darius, just to save the boys from flying basic economy. They are my sons, Darius declared, puffing out his chest and completely buying into the twisted reality his sister was spinning. When Maya realizes she cannot afford to feed them on her own dime, she will send them back to Atlanta. And when she does, she will have zero legal leverage. She signed away everything today. She walked away with empty pockets just to prove a point. She is financially ruined. Vivian waved her hand dismissively through the air, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. Do not even speak her name in this room, Darius. This space is for family only. Vivian shifted her focus away from her son and turned her gaze to Chloe. The harsh, judgmental lines on the older woman's face instantly melted into an expression of profound adoration. She reached out and patted Chloe's knee gently with a diamond-ringed hand. I told you a decade ago that marrying that Louisiana girl was a generational mistake, Vivian stated loudly, ensuring everyone in the room heard her validation. She never fit the aesthetic of this family. She had no pedigree, no society connections, and absolutely zero understanding of how the black elite operates in this city. She was a charity case who dragged down our visual brand. We tried to integrate her into Jack and Jill, and she embarrassed us with her complete lack of refinement. Vivian leaned closer to Chloe, practically beaming. Now Chloe, on the other hand, is the exact proper fit to carry the next generation of Pierce men. You have a beautiful light-skinned complexion, good hair, and a father who sits on the board of our country club. You have a pedigree that speaks for itself. You understand the heavy weight of the Pierce legacy. You are practically bred for this lifestyle, my dear. You are the perfect puzzle piece we have been missing all these years. Chloe blushed deeply, lowering her eyelashes in a practiced display of modesty. She rubbed her subtle bump affectionately, basking in the overwhelming approval of the matriarch. She knew exactly how to play this family, acting as the submissive, grateful addition they so desperately wanted. Thank you, Mrs. Pierce, Chloe said softly, her voice intentionally melodic and sickeningly sweet. I just want to make Darius happy. He works so incredibly hard at the private equity firm, dealing with millions of dollars every day. He deserves a woman who supports his ambitions instead of fighting him at every turn. Maya never understood how to be a soft, supportive partner. I promise I will raise this baby to respect the massive empire Darius is building. I want this child to represent everything your family stands for. Maya never appreciated the position she held, but I know exactly how lucky I am to step into this role. Darius felt a rush of absolute power. The panic of losing the Range Rover completely dissolved, replaced by the intoxicating validation of his mother, his sister, and his beautiful, subservient new partner. He walked over to the velvet sofa and placed a highly possessive hand on Chloe's shoulder, standing tall. This baby changes absolutely everything, Darius declared, looking around the room with supreme arrogance. This is my true heir. This child is going to inherit the Pierce Logistics empire, my private equity portfolio, and the entire generational wealth my father built from the ground up. Maya walking away and refusing my money was the best thing she could have possibly done. She cleared the path. Now the Pierce bloodline remains pure and uncontested. We are wiping the slate clean. Terrence shifted violently in his wingback chair. The leather squeaked loudly beneath him. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket and dabbed aggressively at his forehead, swiping away a fresh layer of nervous sweat. "Well, cheers to the new addition to the family," Terrence said rapidly, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He practically leaped out of his chair to grab a bottle of sparkling mineral water from the credenza, pouring it with shaking hands. The glass rattled noisily against the bottleneck. A new baby is a fresh start for everyone. Right, Chloe? A completely blank slate. Let us just focus on the future and forget all the messy divorce drama from this morning. There is no need to dwell on genetics and bloodlines. Family is family. Jada glared at her husband, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. You are only saying that because your commercial real estate deals have been stressing you out, Terrence. You want everything in life to be easy and conflict-free because you cannot handle pressure. But my brother just shed a decade of dead weight. We have every right to celebrate his absolute liberation today. Terrence forced a hollow, panicked smile, nodding rapidly as he backed away from his furious wife and retreated to his chair. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, refusing to look anywhere near Chloe's glowing, pregnant stomach. Vivian nodded in fervent agreement with her daughter. Jada is exactly right. The Pierce name requires strength and flawless genetics. We are a dynasty, Darius, and a dynasty must protect its precious assets from outsiders who only want to drain our resources and dilute our brand. Today is a victory for our lineage. Chloe is the future of this family, and we will make sure everyone in Atlanta society knows it. The heavy atmosphere of arrogance and false superiority hung thick in the air, wrapping around the Pierce family like a protective blanket. They sat in their luxurious bubble, completely convinced of their untouchable status, utterly unaware of the catastrophic truth ticking away like a time bomb right in front of them. Dr. Arrington stepped into the room. He was the head of maternal fetal medicine, a distinguished older gentleman with silver hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of commanding, quiet authority that only comes from decades of catering to Atlanta's absolute wealthiest families. He wore a crisp, tailored white coat over a designer suit, carrying a thick, leather-bound medical file and an iPad. Right behind him walked a smiling, highly professional nurse, carrying a silver tray lined with crystal flutes and a chilled bottle of imported non-alcoholic sparkling cider. "Good morning, Pierce family," Dr. Arrington greeted them, his voice warm, resonant, and practiced. "It is always a pleasure to see all of you. I know you have been anxiously awaiting the results of the comprehensive non-invasive prenatal testing panel. We rushed the lab work specifically for you, Darius, knowing how important this milestone is for your family legacy." Darius stepped forward, his chest puffed out with maximum arrogance. He smoothly took a crystal flute from the nurse's tray and handed it to Chloe before taking one for himself. He looked at the doctor with a smug, self-satisfied grin. "We appreciate the priority service, Doctor," Darius said, swirling the sparkling cider in his glass. "We only want the absolute best care for the next Pierce heir. I am building an empire, and an empire needs a proper foundation. Do not keep us in suspense any longer. Are we ordering blue confetti or pink confetti for the gala next month?" Dr. Arrington smiled broadly, setting his leather folder down on the marble credenza. He tapped his iPad screen, looking up at the expectant faces gathered around him. "Well, Darius, you can start ordering the blue balloons," Dr. Arrington announced happily. "Congratulations to you and Chloe. You are having a healthy, actively developing baby boy." The private suite instantly erupted into joyous, chaotic cheers. Vivian clapped her hands together in sheer delight, praising the heavens for delivering a male heir to carry on the powerful family name. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around Darius, kissing his cheek repeatedly. Jada let out a loud, triumphant shout, practically jumping up and down in her designer heels. Chloe performed a delicate practice squeal of happiness, burying her face perfectly into Darius's chest as he wrapped a highly possessive arm around her shoulders. In the far corner, Terrence clapped his hands together loudly, though his movements were completely rigid. His smile looked as though it had been painted onto his face, tight and entirely unnatural, but in the midst of the overwhelming celebration, no one noticed his intense physical discomfort. "I knew it!" Vivian declared loudly, her voice cutting through the cheers. "I knew it in my bones. I always said that Maya was the problem. We wasted years and hundreds of thousands of dollars on the best fertility specialists in the state for that woman, and she could never give us a boy. Her genetics were clearly flawed from the start." But Chloe Vivian turned and beamed at the young mistress. "You are absolutely perfect. You are giving this family exactly what it deserves, a pure, strong Pierce boy." Darius raised his crystal flute high into the air, demanding the room's attention. He looked around completely intoxicated by his own perceived supremacy. "To my son," Darius proclaimed loudly. "To the boy who will inherit the logistics company, the real estate portfolio, and the Pierce name." Maya walking away this morning was a blessing in disguise. She cleared the path for greatness. The family echoed the toast, sipping their sparkling cider with expressions of absolute victory. They were entirely consumed by their own arrogance, completely blind to the subtle shift happening right in front of them. Dr. Arrington had not joined in the toast. He stood near the credenza, his warm, celebratory smile slowly vanishing. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up the bridge of his nose and stared intently at the glowing screen of his iPad. He scrolled down his brow, furrowing into a deep, highly clinical frown. He tapped the screen again, double-checking the data, his posture growing rigid. The sudden silence from the doctor drew Vivian's attention. She lowered her glass, her sharp eyes instantly picking up on the medical professional's change in demeanor. The triumphant atmosphere in the room evaporated, replaced by a sudden heavy chill. "Is there a problem, doctor?" Vivian demanded, her voice sharp and authoritative. She took a step toward him, her maternal instincts flaring defensively. "Why are you frowning? My grandson must be in perfect condition. We do not tolerate defects in this family." Dr. Arrington sighed softly, pressing a button to lock his iPad screen. He looked up, his expression shifting from congratulatory to entirely serious. "The baby is currently growing at a normal, healthy rate." Dr. Arrington reassured her quickly, holding up a hand to calm the rising panic. "However, there is another component of the NIPT panel that we need to discuss immediately. As you know, because you requested our premium concierge package, we run a highly comprehensive genetic screening to check for any hereditary anomalies, chromosomal conditions, or potential future health risks." Darius frowned, stepping away from Chloe and walking toward the doctor. His protective, arrogant stance returned. "What kind of anomalies?" he asked defensively. "My family has a flawless medical history. We do not have genetic issues." "Genetics can be incredibly complex, Darius," Dr. Arrington replied, his tone remaining carefully measured and diplomatic. The screening revealed a very specific and highly unusual anomaly in the child's blood profile. The baby is carrying the genetic trait for sickle cell. The room fell silent. Darius stared at the doctor, completely baffled. He shook his head aggressively, letting out a short, dismissive laugh. "That is absolutely impossible," Darius stated firmly, his voice rising in volume. "I do not have the sickle cell trait. When Maya and I were going through our intensive fertility counseling 3 years ago, we did every single genetic test known to modern medicine. I paid for the most advanced panels available. I am completely negative. You have my files right there in your system, doctor. Check them yourself. You clearly made a mistake in the lab." "I did check your files, Darius," Dr. Arrington responded calmly, refusing to be intimidated by Darius's aggressive tone. "I pulled your complete medical history from our archives this morning when the lab results flagged the anomaly. Your records confirm that you are indeed entirely negative for the trait. I also ran Chloe's individual blood work during her initial intake appointment last week." Chloe is a confirmed carrier of the sickle cell trait. Chloe nodded rapidly, eager to clear herself of any perceived flaw or blame. She stepped forward, wringing her hands together nervously. Yes, my mother is a carrier. I have always known I had the trait, but it has never affected my health in any way. It is completely dormant. Since Darius is negative, the baby should just be a carrier like me. There is no actual danger to the child's health. It is fine. Dr. Arrington looked at Chloe, his eyes entirely devoid of emotion. That would be correct under standard medical circumstances. The doctor explained, his voice growing incredibly tense and heavy. If a carrier mother and a negative father conceive, the child has a 50% chance of being a carrier. But the child you are carrying is not just a carrier of the standard sickle cell trait. Vivian practically vibrated with impatience. Then what is it? Speak plainly, doctor. Stop speaking in riddles. What does this mean for the baby's aesthetic and future capabilities? Can it be fixed with medication or a specialized diet? It cannot be fixed, Mrs. Pierce, because it is a foundational genetic marker. Dr. Arrington stated, turning his iPad around so the complex medical charts faced the family, though none of them understood the data. The genetic panel flagged a secondary extremely rare mutation interacting with the sickle cell trait. The child carries a specific beta thalassemia gene mutation. This particular mutation originates from a very isolated lineage. When combined with the sickle cell trait, it creates a highly unique, unmistakable genetic fingerprint. Darius clenched his jaw, his patience entirely depleted. I do not care about rare fingerprints, doctor. I care about my son. Are you telling me my child is sick? Are you telling me Chloe gave my son a disease? Jada gasped, glaring viciously at Chloe. You told us your family was healthy, Jada accused loudly. You told us you had a clean pedigree. If you tainted my brother's bloodline with some rare disease, I will personally ruin you. Dr. Arrington raised his voice, cutting through the rising family hostility with absolute clinical authority. Please, listen to me carefully, he commanded, forcing the room into silence. The child is not currently presenting as sick, but you are missing the fundamental biological reality of this situation, Darius. Genetics is an exact, unforgiving science. A child inherits one set of alleles from the mother and one set from the biological father. There are no exceptions to this rule. The doctor took a slow, deliberate step toward Darius, looking him directly in the eyes. Chloe provided the sickle cell trait. We know this for a fact, but the rare beta thalassemia mutation is entirely separate. Because your medical records confirm that you do not possess this highly specific beta thalassemia mutation, it is scientifically, biologically, and medically impossible for you to be the father of this child. The air in the room was instantly sucked out. It was as if a massive vacuum had engaged, leaving everyone completely breathless. Darius froze instantly. His crystal flute slipped from his fingers, crashing onto the hardwood floor and shattering into 100 glittering pieces. He did not even flinch at the sound. Vivian stumbled backward, her mouth opening and closing silently. She grabbed the back of the velvet sofa to keep herself from collapsing, her knuckles turning bone white. That is a lie! Darius roared, his voice cracking with sudden explosive rage. The denial was instant and aggressive. You mixed up the lab results. My family pays this clinic hundreds of thousands of dollars for premium care, and you bring me faulty, incompetent labs. Chloe is carrying my son. She has been entirely loyal to me. She knows what is at stake. I assure you, Darius, there is absolutely no mistake. Dr. Arrington stated firmly, his professional composure never wavering. The lab ran the genetic sequence twice because the mutation is so incredibly rare. In fact, it is so rare that I did not even need to look it up. I instantly recognized the specific genetic sequence when it flagged in our system this morning. The doctor paused. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room pressed against the eardrums of everyone present. Slowly, deliberately, Dr. Arrington shifted his gaze. He looked away from Darius, away from a weeping Chloe, and away from a horrified Vivian. His eyes landed squarely on Terrence Washington. Terrence had completely retreated into the shadows of the wingback chair. His face was entirely ashen, devoid of all blood. He was sweating so profusely that his expensive silk shirt was practically plastered to his chest. His eyes darted frantically toward the heavy mahogany door, visually calculating the distance and his chances of escape. "Terence," Dr. Arrington said softly, the clinical detachment in his voice cutting through the room like a perfectly sharpened scalpel. "I consulted on a severe, life-threatening hematology case right here in this exact hospital building about 14 months ago. A patient came into the emergency room suffering from a massive pulmonary embolism. The hematology department spent days running diagnostics. They finally discovered that the blood clot was caused by a highly unusual documented combination of the sickle cell trait and a remarkably rare beta thalassemia mutation." The doctor adjusted his glasses, his eyes locked onto the terrified real estate broker. "You were that patient, Terence." Dr. Arrington concluded, his words dropping like physical weights onto the floor. "You carry this exact rare genetic profile." The absolute silence that followed Dr. Arrington's clinical statement lasted only a fraction of a second, but it felt like a suffocating eternity. Terence Washington's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. He looked frantically toward the heavy mahogany door, visually calculating the distance and his chances of escape. He then looked back at the doctor, and finally his terrified gaze landed on his wife. Jada was perfectly still. Her eyes darted from the doctor to her sweating husband, and then slowly settled on Chloe's subtly rounding stomach. The mental math clicked into place behind her eyes with brutal precision. The timeline, the secret glances, the rare genetic marker. Jada let out a guttural, blood-curdling shriek that tore through the sterile clinic air. It was a visceral sound completely devoid of her usual polished society veneer. She dropped her expensive Birkin bag to the floor and lunged across the private suite with terrifying speed, her designer heels skidding slightly against the polished hardwood. "You slept with my husband!" Jada screamed, her manicured hands extending like claws. She slammed into Chloe with the force of a freight train. Chloe shrieked in absolute terror, stumbling backward and crashing hard against the marble credenza. Jada grabbed a fistful of Chloe's perfectly styled hair with one hand and hooked her other hand into the collar of the bespoke cream maternity dress. With a vicious downward yank, the expensive fabric tore straight down the middle. The loud sound of ripping silk echoed sharply in the room. Chloe scrambled desperately, throwing her arms over her face to protect herself as Jada slapped, scratched, and clawed at her shoulders. The pristine image of the demure, perfect air carrier was instantly shredded. "Get off me!" Chloe wailed hysterically, tears streaming down her face. "It was not my fault. He came after me. He pursued me." Terence finally unfroze. Panic completely hijacked his nervous system. "Jada, stop it right now. You are going to hurt the baby," he yelled, rushing forward and grabbing his wife tightly around the waist, trying to physically drag her away from his pregnant mistress. "Do not you dare put your hands on me!" Jada roared, spinning around with wild feral energy. She broke free from his grip and delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Terrence's face. The smack sounded like a gunshot in the confined space. A bright red handprint instantly bloomed across his sweating cheek. "You disgusting, pathetic excuse for a man. My family gave you absolutely everything. I bought your custom suits. I paid off your ridiculous business debts. We handed you a life of luxury on a silver platter, and you repay me by impregnating my brother's trashy gold-digging secretary." Terence held his hands up defensively, cowering away from his furious wife. "Jada, please just let me explain." It was a mistake. It meant nothing. Darius stood completely paralyzed by the floor-to-ceiling window. His mind was severely fracturing. Just an hour ago, he had finalized his divorce. He had mocked Maya, belittled her intelligence, and bragged endlessly about the superior, highly bred woman who was carrying his immaculate legacy. He had thrown away a fiercely loyal wife for a woman who was actively sleeping with his own brother-in-law. His entire sense of manhood, his towering arrogance, and his precious pride were being systematically eradicated right in front of him. "Speak, Chloe," Darius commanded, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low, guttural growl that silenced the room. He stepped toward her, his fists clenched so tightly his fingernails dug painfully into his palms. Look me in the eyes and tell me the absolute truth right now. When exactly did you sleep with him? Chloe was backed firmly against the wall, sobbing uncontrollably. Thick black rivers of expensive mascara ran down her cheeks, ruining her flawless makeup. She looked desperately at Terrence, pleading silently for him to defend her, but Terrence was entirely focused on shielding his face from Jada's wrath. Chloe was entirely on her own. It was during the Morehouse homecoming weekend. Chloe wailed, her voice trembling violently as the ugly truth finally spilled out into the open. You went to Atlanta for the alumni galas and left me entirely alone at the office to handle your schedule. Terrence came by the firm to drop off some commercial real estate documents for your father. You always ignored me, Darius. You treated me like a pretty trophy, but you never actually listened to a word I said. Terrence paid attention to me. He told me I was beautiful and underappreciated. We went out for drinks. It was just one night. I swear to God, it was just one night. Jada let out another scream of pure fury, lunging forward again, but Terrence physically blocked her path, taking another sharp blow to his shoulder. I did not even know I was pregnant until weeks later. Chloe sobbed, sliding down the wall slightly. And when I found out you were so incredibly excited to have an heir, you bought me this luxury condo and gave me the platinum cards. I was terrified of losing it all. I just went along with it to secure my future because I knew you would take care of me. I wanted this lifestyle, Darius. I just wanted to belong. You parasitic gold digger! Jada shrieked, her voice hoarse from screaming. You ruined my entire life for a paycheck. You are nothing but trash. Near the plush velvet sofa, Vivian Pierce was hyperventilating. Her manicured hands clutched her chest as she watched the chaotic, vulgar violence unfolding in front of her. The impeccable, flawless image of the Pierce dynasty she had spent her entire adult life cultivating was burning to the ground in a matter of minutes. The highly celebrated royal heir was a bastard. The pristine bloodline was hopelessly tainted by a deceitful mistress and a broke real estate broker. The public humiliation they were about to endure would be absolute, brutal, and entirely inescapable. My heart! Vivian gasped loudly, her eyes rolling back slightly into her head. Her fingers dug desperately into her collarbone. The heavy string of signature pearls around her neck snapped sharply under the extreme pressure of her frantic grip. Dozens of expensive white pearls cascaded down the front of her knit suit, bouncing and scattering wildly across the polished hardwood floor like tiny, loud hailstones. Vivian's knees buckled completely, and she collapsed heavily onto the plush carpet in a dead faint. No one moved to help her. The chaos in the room was too all-consuming. Dr. Arrington and his nurse had already quietly slipped out the door, recognizing that their medical duties were over and a monumental family implosion had begun. Darius felt acidic bile rising in his throat. He had financed Chloe's luxury lifestyle. He had given her unrestricted access to his wealth. He had paraded her in front of his wealthy colleagues as the ultimate prize. And all the while she was carrying the child of the slick, fast-talking brother-in-law he had always secretly despised. He had been the ultimate laughable fool. I am going to destroy both of you. Darius whispered, his voice shaking with a terrifying, icy rage. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his smartphone. His hands trembled wildly as he navigated his contacts. I am going to freeze every single asset you possess. Terrence, you live in a house my family owns. You drive luxury cars leased directly by the Pierce Family Trust. I am calling the private bank right this second. I am cutting off your personal accounts, your credit lines, and all your commercial business loans. You will be living on the street by midnight. Terrence finally panicked, lunging forward with his hands outstretched pleadingly. Darius, please be reasonable. We can handle this privately. We do not need to involve the bank or the trust. If you freeze my accounts, my pending real estate deals will instantly collapse. I will be financially ruined. I will lose everything. Darius ignored him completely, stepping over his mother's scattered pearls on the floor as he hit the speed dial for his private banking concierge at Vanguard Financial. He paced aggressively, channeling every ounce of his shattered ego into pure financial vengeance. The phone rang twice. before a highly polished professional voice answered on the other end. Vanguard Private Wealth Management. This is Mr. Hayes speaking. How can I assist you today, Mr. Pierce? Hayes listened to me very carefully. Darius barked into the phone, projecting his remaining authority in a desperate attempt to regain control of the room. I am executing an immediate total freeze on all secondary accounts linked to the Pierce Family Trust. Block all credit cards issued to Chloe Evans and Terrence Washington. Cancel all pending real estate wire transfers for Terrence's brokerage firm. I want them cut off entirely. Do it right this second. There was a long, highly uncomfortable pause on the other end of the line. The faint sound of rapid keyboard typing echoed through the phone's speaker. Terrence stood completely frozen, his breath catching in his throat as he waited for his financial execution. I apologize, Mr. Pierce. The banker said, his tone shifting into a rigid corporate protocol. But I am afraid I cannot process that request for you today. You do not currently have the required authorization to alter the status of those accounts. Darius stopped pacing abruptly. His heart skipped a painful beat. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice rising in disbelief. I am the vice president of the family trust. My name is on the primary charter alongside my father. Execute my orders immediately, or I will have your job before the end of the day. Mr. Pierce, I strongly advise you to check your mobile banking application. The banker replied calmly, completely unfazed by Darius's aggressive threat. Your administrative access to the Pierce Family Trust, along with your personal credit lines and all linked secondary cards, were frozen and fully revoked at exactly 9 o'clock this morning. Darius felt the opulent room violently spinning around him. He pulled the phone away from his ear and quickly logged into his mobile banking app. A bright red banner flashed aggressively across the top of his screen reading, "Account suspended. Contact primary administrator. Who authorized this freeze?" Darius demanded, pressing the phone back to his ear, his voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming panic. Who has the authority to lock me out of my own family's wealth? The order came directly from the primary account holder and new majority shareholder of your corporate trust. The banker stated clearly and without hesitation. The total asset freeze was executed by Ms. Maya Jackson. If you have any further inquiries regarding your financial status, you will need to contact her directly. Have a pleasant afternoon, Mr. Pierce. The line went completely dead. The busy signal echoed loudly in the silent room. Darius slowly lowered the phone, his mouth hanging open in absolute, unadulterated shock. Maya had not just taken her car back. Maya had quietly and methodically locked the entire Pierce family out of their own generational fortune. He was completely, utterly broke. Darius stared at the dead screen of his phone, the busy signal buzzing like a warning siren in his ear. He shoved the device into his pocket and spun around. The chaos in the clinic suite was still at a fever pitch. Jada was hurling a heavy crystal vase at Terrence, missing his head by an inch and shattering the glass against the silk wallpaper. Chloe was curled into a weeping ball on the floor. Darius ignored all of them. He marched over to his mother, grabbed her by the arm, and forcefully hauled her up from the carpet. "Get up!" Darius commanded, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. "We are leaving right this second. We have to go to Vanguard Financial." Vivian gasped, her eyes fluttering open as she swatted blindly at the air. Her pristine St. John knit suit was hopelessly wrinkled and a few rogue pearls rolled away under her designer heels. "Vanguard." Vivian mumbled, her aristocratic composure severely fractured. "Why are we going to Vanguard? My grandson is a bastard, Darius. That real estate rat tainted our bloodline. You need to call the police on that girl." "Forget the girl!" Darius shouted, his voice echoing violently over Jada's shrieking. Maya froze the accounts. Every single one of them. The trust, the credit lines, the corporate cards. Everything is locked. We have to go downtown and fix this before my equity deals fall through at noon. The 15-mile ride from the clinic to the towering glass skyscraper of Vanguard Financial in downtown Atlanta was agonizing. Darius had to order another rideshare, forcing himself and his hyperventilating mother into the back of a standard black sedan. Vivian spent the entire ride adjusting her ruined collar and muttering threats. She was completely convinced that Maya had somehow committed cyber terrorism. To Vivian, the idea that a working-class girl from Louisiana could legally outmaneuver the Pierce family was not just impossible, it was a literal crime. She hired a hacker, Vivian stated aggressively, pointing a shaking manicured finger at the back of the driver's headrest. That is the only logical explanation. She tapped into the Vanguard mainframe and locked us out of pure bitter spite. When we get to the office, I want you to have the chief financial officer call the FBI. I want that swamp trash arrested for wire fraud and corporate espionage. She is going to rot in a federal prison for touching my money. Darius stared out the window, his jaw tight. He did not bother answering her. A cold, heavy knot of dread was rapidly expanding in his stomach. The banker had sounded too calm, too procedural. Hackers caused panic. Legal account freezes caused polite corporate protocol. The Vanguard Financial Building loomed over the Atlanta skyline, a sharp monument of steel and dark glass. Darius stormed through the revolving doors with Vivian hot on his heels. He completely bypassed the plush reception area, ignoring the startled receptionist calling out his name. He marched directly toward the executive glass corner office belonging to Arthur Sterling, the chief financial officer who had managed the Pierce family trust for the last decade. Darius shoved the heavy glass door open without knocking. Arthur Sterling was an impeccably dressed, sharp-featured man in his late 50s. He did not look surprised to see them. In fact, he was already standing at the head of a massive mahogany conference table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. There was no warmth in his expression, no deferential smile that usually greeted the Pierce family. He looked at Darius and Vivian with a gaze of profound clinical pity. "Arthur, what the hell is going on?" Darius roared, slamming his hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. "Someone completely unauthorized just froze my entire life. Turn the cards back on right this second. I have a closing wire transfer scheduled for 1 o'clock, and if it bounces, I'm going to sue this entire firm into the ground." Vivian stepped up beside her son, lifting her chin with supreme arrogance. "Arthur, I demand you call the federal authorities immediately. My ex-daughter-in-law has illegally breached our family trust. I want her assets seized, and I want her thrown in a cell. This is a massive security failure on your part, and someone is going to pay for it." Arthur did not flinch. He did not reach for his phone. He did not apologize. Instead, he reached down to the floor beside his chair and hoisted a massive, incredibly thick black leather binder onto the table. He dropped it with a resounding heavy thud that made Vivian physically jump backward. "There is absolutely no wire fraud happening today, Mrs. Pierce," Arthur said, his voice entirely calm and detached. "There is no cyber attack. There is no security breach. There is only a gross generational misunderstanding of your own family's financial reality." Darius glared at the heavy binder. "What is that?" Arthur flipped the binder open. The pages were dense with complex legal jargon, corporate seals, and extensive financial audits. "This is the unredacted complete history of the Pierce Logistics Company and the Pierce Family Trust," Arthur explained, tapping the top page with a gold pen. "Darius, you have spent the last 5 years walking around Atlanta bragging about the generational wealth your father built. You believed he was a titan of industry who conquered the market before he passed away." "He was a titan," Vivian snapped defensively. "He built that logistics empire from nothing. We are royalty in this city." "He built an empire and then he completely ran it into the ground," Arthur corrected sharply, cutting off Vivian's grand delusion. "Your husband was a terrible gambler, Vivian. He over-leveraged the logistics company on disastrous commercial real estate ventures. 5 years ago, the Pierce family business was quietly, completely bankrupt. You were drowning in over $40 million of corporate debt. The bank was 72 hours away from seizing your homes, your cars, and liquidating the entire company for parts." Darius felt his knees go weak. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. "That is impossible," he stammered, the arrogant heat entirely draining from his face. "My father turned the company around. We had a record-breaking quarter 5 years ago. We expanded. He left me a thriving trust." "Your father did not turn anything around," Arthur stated brutally, turning a page in the binder to reveal a dense contract covered in red ink signatures. He panicked and he sold out. 72 hours before the banks foreclosed on your entire life, a shadow private equity firm swooped in and offered a massive bailout. They paid off the $40 million debt in absolute secrecy to avoid a public scandal. But they did not do it out of charity. Arthur slid the contract across the smooth mahogany surface toward Darius. In exchange for saving the Pierce family from absolute ruin, this private equity firm demanded and purchased exactly 60% of the voting shares of Pierce Logistics. They took majority ownership. They own the company, Darius. They own the trust. You and your mother have been living on an extremely generous corporate allowance extended to you by the majority shareholder. The cars you drive, the houses you live in, the credit cards you swipe so freely, they all belong to the equity firm. You are essentially just highly paid employees of your own last name. Vivian clutched her chest, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She stared at the contract, recognizing her late husband's frantic signature at the bottom of the page. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling with sheer horror. "No, we are the Pierces. We own this city. We do not work for anyone." "You have worked for them for 5 years," Arthur corrected coldly. "And this morning, at exactly 9 o'clock, the majority shareholder executed a legal clause to completely dissolve the secondary accounts due to reckless financial mismanagement. Your credit lines were legally closed. The trust is frozen. Your allowance has been permanently terminated. You have exactly what is in your personal checking accounts and absolutely nothing else." Darius felt a cold, suffocating terror gripping his throat. The multi-million-dollar empire he thought he ruled was a complete mirage. His father had sold the crown to save face. He was not a king. He was a corporate puppet dancing on strings he did not even know existed. His mind raced frantically, trying to find a way out, a way to leverage his remaining social capital to save his crumbling ego. "Who is it?" Darius demanded, his voice dropping to a desperate, raspy whisper. "Who owns the shadow firm? Who bought us?" Vivian slammed her hand on the table, her arrogance flaring up in one final desperate burst of delusion. "Call them!" she shrieked at Arthur, her face red with exertion. "Call the head of this private equity firm right now. I know everyone on the board of every major corporation in Atlanta. I will demand a meeting. We will negotiate a buyout. We will take our company back. Tell this firm's president that Vivian Pierce is on the line, and she expects immediate compliance." Arthur looked at Vivian, a heavy, exhausted sigh escaping his lips. He closed the thick leather binder with a definitive snap. "I do not need to call her Vivian," Arthur said quietly, stepping away from the table and picking up a small silver remote control. "She fully anticipated that you would end up storming into this exact room today demanding answers. She left a personal video message specifically for you both." Arthur pointed the remote at the far wall. A massive 80-inch flat-screen monitor silently hummed to life. The screen flickered for a brief second before a crystal-clear, high-definition video began to play. Darius and Vivian completely froze, staring at the screen in absolute paralyzing horror. Maya Jackson was sitting on the sprawling wraparound porch of a magnificent southern estate. The morning sun caught the flawless, radiant glow of her skin. She was completely barefaced, wearing a simple, elegant white linen dress that made her look incredibly youthful and entirely unbothered. She was leaning back in a plush wicker chair, the lush green Louisiana landscape stretching out endlessly behind her. She held a tall crystal glass filled with iced sweet tea, a slice of lemon resting perfectly on the rim. She took a slow, deliberate sip from the glass, her eyes locking directly onto the camera lens. The soft, genuine smile playing on her lips was the most terrifying thing Darius had ever seen. "Hello, Darius. Hello, Vivian," Maya said, her voice smooth, calm, and dripping with absolute authority. "Welcome to the real world. I hope you are paying very close attention. I am sure you are both standing in Arthur's office right now, completely out of breath, demanding to know who hacked your accounts and plotting how to throw someone in federal prison." Maya said, her voice projecting through the high-definition speakers with a crisp, terrifying clarity. She set her crystal glass down on the small wicker table beside her. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Vivian. But there is no hacker. There is no glitch in the Vanguard mainframe. There is only me. Maya leaned forward, resting her elbows gracefully on her knees. For 10 years, you both made it your absolute mission to remind me that I was an outsider. Vivian, you told your little Jack and Jill society friends that I was a charity case. You whispered at your country club luncheons that Darius had married Louisiana swamp trash. You said I had no pedigree, no understanding of wealth, and no business sitting at your mahogany dining tables. Maya let out a soft melodic laugh that sent a violent shiver straight down Darius's spine. You were right about one thing, Vivian. I am from the swamp. Maya said, her eyes gleaming with a ruthless, predatory light. But what your arrogant classist mind failed to realize is that my family actually owns the swamp. We own the commercial real estate built on top of it. We own the vast oil leases buried underneath it. We own the shipping ports, the development land, and the supply chains. My grandfather did not just fish in the bayou. He bought the entire parish. My family's money does not scream in flashy sports cars or demand attention at charity galas. Our money is old, it is quiet, and it is massive. And it is. Darius reached up with a violently trembling hand and yanked aggressively at the knot of his custom silk tie. The collar of his expensive dress shirt suddenly felt exactly like a hangman's noose. A thick, icy bead of sweat broke out across his forehead, sliding slowly down his temple and stinging his eye. He was actively gasping for air, his chest heaving as his perfectly manicured reality violently fractured into a million unrecoverable pieces. Darius. Maya continued, her gaze shifting slightly, as if she were looking directly into his soul. You had an incredibly fragile ego. You desperately needed to be the king. You needed to be the ultimate provider, the brilliant savior who rescued the poor, uneducated girl and draped her in designer clothes. You needed me to be small so that you could feel tall. I loved you, so I played the part. I wore the clothes you picked out. I smiled at your insufferable colleagues. I let you explain basic economic concepts to me at dinner parties, while I secretly managed a portfolio that dwarfed your entire firm. I made myself your submissive, grateful shadow because I thought protecting your pride was how I proved my loyalty. Maya paused, her expression hardening into absolute stone. But then, 5 years ago, your precious Pierce Logistics began to hemorrhage money. Maya stated, her voice dropping into a deadly corporate cadence. Your father had gambled the company away on terrible commercial real estate investments. You were entirely bankrupt, Darius. The banks were 72 hours away from seizing your home, repossessing your cars, and liquidating the company to pay off $40 million in toxic debt. Vivian let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, backing away from the television screen, as if it were emitting a physical heat. She bumped into the leather chairs, her eyes wide with a manic, unraveling horror. I watched you pacing the floors of our house, sweating, terrified, realizing you were about to lose the only thing that gave you an identity. Maya said softly. I knew if I just handed you a check to save the company, your ego would shatter completely. You could never survive knowing your wife bailed you out. You would have resented me forever, so I protected your pride one last time. I directed my wealth management team in New Orleans to establish a shadow private equity firm. I bought your debt. I bought your company. I bailed you out in complete secrecy. Darius stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table. His legs refused to support his weight. He slid down slightly, his hands gripping the mahogany edge so hard his knuckles turned purple. He was hyperventilating, his mind desperately rejecting the information, but the heavy, unredacted binder sitting on the table in front of him offered absolutely no refuge. For the last 5 years, Darius, you have been parading me around Atlanta like a trophy you purchased. Maya said, her southern drawl completely vanishing, replaced by the lethal clinical tone of a corporate titan. You bragged about your generational wealth. You lectured me about how the Pierce family built empires. You demanded my submission, and all the while you were literally working for me. I was your majority shareholder. I was your ultimate boss. I owned the roof over your head. I owned the clothes on your back. And I owned the platinum credit cards you used to finance your pathetic, trashy little affair with your secretary. The silence in Arthur Sterling's office was absolutely deafening. Arthur stood perfectly still in the corner, his face an impassive mask as he watched the complete psychological destruction of the two most arrogant clients he had ever managed. Vivian was weeping silently. Her impeccable makeup was ruined and her chest heaved with ragged, shallow breaths. The dynasty she had worshipped was a complete illusion. The bloodline she thought was superior was currently being dismantled by a woman she had spent a decade treating like dirt. "But I am a fair woman," Maya continued, crossing her legs gracefully. "I was perfectly content to let you live in your little fantasy world, Darius. I was willing to let you play king of the castle until the day we died. But then you brought Chloe into my home. You disrespected me. You tried to humiliate me. You decided to throw me away like a broken toy because I could not give you the biological heir your mother so desperately demanded." Maya leaned closer to the camera, her eyes blazing with absolute unadulterated vengeance. "So let us talk about this morning, Darius." Maya smiled, a terrifyingly bright expression. "Let us talk about the divorce papers you were so eager to sign. You walked into that law firm parking lot acting like a conquering general. You took my car keys. You bragged about leaving me with nothing. You demanded I sign the prenuptial agreement enforcement waiving my right to any of your precious Pierce assets. You were so incredibly eager to see me financially ruined that you did not bother to have your attorneys actually read the exit clauses on page 47. Darius let out a choked, desperate gasp. He stared at the screen, his mouth hanging open. His heart was hammering against his ribs with such violent force he thought it might break through his chest. "When you signed those papers this morning, Darius, you legally dissolved our marriage," Maya explained, slowly enunciating every single syllable. "But my corporate attorneys inserted a standard asset withdrawal clause into that specific section. By signing those divorce papers, you legally acknowledged that the shadow firm's partnership with Pierce Logistics was contingent upon our legal union. Because the marriage is now permanently dissolved, the firm is legally pulling its capital out of the Pierce estate." Vivian shrieked a raw, terrifying sound of absolute defeat. She dropped to her knees on the expensive carpet, hiding her face in her trembling hands. "I am liquidating my 60% equity, Darius," Maya stated, her voice echoing off the glass walls of the office. "The $40 million debt that I absorbed 5 years ago is now entirely back on your shoulders, and the bank is calling the loan in today. You triggered your own financial execution. You signed your own bankruptcy papers because you were too arrogant to read the fine print." Darius was visibly shaking. Sweat dripped off his chin, landing silently on his expensive silk tie. He felt as though the floor had simply vanished beneath him, leaving him falling through an endless dark void. He had absolutely nothing. The company was gone. The trust was gone. The houses, the cars, the status, the legacy. All of it was completely erased by a single signature he had provided just hours ago. "And as a final piece of house cleaning," Maya said, her tone suddenly shifting back to a casual, breezy warmth, "Vanguard Financial has officially terminated your administrative access. You cannot move a single dime. The Pierce family allowance is permanently canceled. You have whatever pocket change is sitting in your personal checking accounts. I highly recommend you start budgeting immediately. I hear Chloe has very expensive tastes, and Terrence Washington is going to need a good lawyer when Jada finishes tearing him apart." Maya reached out and picked up her crystal glass of iced tea. She held it up toward the camera in a mock toast. "You wanted an heir to inherit your empire, Darius," Maya said, her smile utterly radiant. "Well, congratulations on the baby. But the empire belongs to the swamp trash. Have a wonderful life." The screen instantly went pitch black. The massive monitor clicked off, leaving the executive office in a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound in the room was Vivian Pierce sobbing hysterically on the floor, her hands clutching at the carpet as if trying to anchor herself to a reality that no longer existed. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, picking up his gold pen and neatly aligning the edges of the thick black binder. He looked down at Darius, who was still slumped against the edge of the conference table, his eyes wide, glassy, and completely vacant. "I have already taken the liberty of printing out your final account statements, Mr. Pierce." Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of any remaining deference. He slid a single thin piece of paper across the mahogany table. As of this moment, your personal checking account holds exactly $4,212. The corporate security team will be arriving at the Buckhead estate tomorrow morning to change the locks and take possession of the property on behalf of the equity firm. I strongly advise you to gather your personal clothing and vacate the premises before noon. Darius did not move. He did not speak. The crushing weight of his monumental failure pinned him to the floor. He had lost his wife. He had lost his company. He had lost his entire generational legacy. And he was currently expecting a child with a mistress who was secretly sleeping with his brother-in-law. The pristine, untouchable Pierce dynasty had been entirely dismantled in a single morning, and Darius had personally handed the wrecking ball to the very woman he thought he had defeated. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite violently crashed open, rebounding off the metal doorstops with a sharp, explosive crack that jolted Darius from his catatonic paralysis. Jada stormed into the room like a localized hurricane. Her usually immaculate silk blouse was torn at the shoulder. Her perfectly coiffed hair was a wild, frantic mess, and her eyes were burning with a manic, unhinged fury. Right behind her, stumbling and frantically trying to adjust his ruined bespoke collar, was Terrence. His cheek still bore the bright, angry red imprint of Jada's vicious slap. "Arthur, freeze his access right this second!" Jada shrieked, marching directly toward the mahogany table, completely ignoring her mother weeping on the floor and her brother staring blankly into space. "I want this parasitic rat cut off from everything. Cancel his corporate cards, lock him out of the brokerage accounts, and revoke his clearance to the Pierce Family Trust. He is dead to this family." Arthur Sterling did not even blink. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and looked at Jada with the same cold, clinical detachment he had just directed at her mother. "I cannot freeze his access, Jada," Arthur stated evenly. "Do not tell me what you cannot do." Jada roared, slamming her manicured hands onto the polished wood. "I am a Pierce. My father built this firm's portfolio. You work for us. Freeze his accounts or I will have you fired by the end of the day." Arthur let out a slow, deeply exhausted breath. "You clearly have not been briefed on the morning's developments, Jada. I cannot freeze your husband's access because there are absolutely no accounts left to freeze. The Pierce Family Trust is officially dissolved. Your corporate allowances have been permanently terminated. Maya Jackson executed a total asset liquidation an hour ago. Every single one of you is completely, unequivocally bankrupt." Jada froze. The manic, furious energy instantly drained from her body, leaving her completely rigid. She looked at Arthur, then slowly turned her head to look at her mother, who was still curled on the carpet, clutching her broken pearl necklace. She looked at Darius, whose face was the color of wet ash. "Bankrupt." Jada whispered the words, sounding entirely foreign on her tongue. "What do you mean, bankrupt? Maya is just a housewife. She does not have the authority to touch our money." "She was your majority shareholder," Arthur corrected sharply. "And she just pulled the plug on your entire existence. You have nothing left, Jada. None of you do." Terrence had been hovering nervously near the doorway, catching his breath, and preparing to weather another storm of Jada's verbal abuse. But the moment Arthur's words registered in his brain, a profound, suffocating terror washed over him. The blood completely drained from his face. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the heavy brass door handle just to keep himself standing. If the Pierce money was gone, his safety net was gone. If the Pierce money was gone, the massive gaping hole he had secretly dug in their finances was about to be exposed to the light of day. There was no way to hide it anymore. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and the panic completely hijacked his nervous system. "No!" Terrence gasped, his voice cracking hysterically. "No, no, no, that cannot be right. The trust cannot be gone. The equity deals, the safety margins. Darius, tell him he is lying. Darius, you promised me the family accounts were untouchable. You told me there was always a slush fund." Darius slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, and his vision was swimming with absolute rage. He glared at the man who had slept with his mistress, the man who had just shattered his sister's life, the man who was now whining about slush funds while their entire dynasty burned to the ground. "You pathetic, sniveling coward!" Darius growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You impregnate the woman carrying my supposed heir. You humiliate my sister, and your first thought is whether you can still leech off my family's money. I am going to end you, Terrence. Terrence backed away, his hands flying up defensively. You do not understand, Darius. You do not understand what is at stake here. I owe people money. Serious, dangerous people. Jada snapped her head toward her husband, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, lethal slits. What are you talking about, Terrence? What people? I had gambling debts. Terrence blurted out the words tumbling from his mouth in a frantic, desperate rush. I had massive losses at the underground tables in Buckhead. They were threatening to break my legs. They were threatening to come to the house. And then Chloe. Chloe started demanding more. You thought you were financing her luxury condo, Darius, but she wanted more than that. She wanted designer bags, expensive trips, jewelry. She threatened to tell Jada about us if I did not keep her happy. I was drowning. I was completely tapped out. Vivian slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. You are a broke, talentless fraud, Vivian spat venomously. You never had a dime to your name before you married my daughter. How exactly did you plan to pay off illegal gambling debts and a greedy mistress? Terrence swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. I needed capital. He stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. I needed a massive cash injection to get the debt collectors off my back and to make a singular foolproof investment that would triple my money. I just needed a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back. I swear to God I was going to pay every single cent back before the quarterly audits. Where did you get the capital, Terrence? Darius demanded, stepping away from the table, his physical presence looming over the smaller man. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact. I used my legal clearance as Jada's husband. I mortgaged her remaining independent trust fund. And I forged your signatures to take out a massive high-interest equity loan against the Martha's Vineyard summer estate. A horrifying, deadly silence fell over the executive office. Jada let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward until her spine hit the glass wall. Her independent trust fund was the only money her father had legally separated from the primary corporate accounts. It was her personal safety net. It was the money she used to fund her charities, her social events, and her entire identity. Vivian let out a sharp, agonizing wail. The Martha's Vineyard estate was a historic, sprawling oceanfront property that had been in the Pierce family for 4 generations. It was the ultimate symbol of their old money status, the crown jewel of their social supremacy. You mortgaged my family's legacy! Vivian shrieked, launching herself at Terrence with surprising speed. You stole my sanctuary! You gave our history to a bank! Arthur caught Vivian by the arm, gently but firmly restraining the older woman before she could physically assault Terrence. It was $4 million. Terrence cried out, holding his hands up to shield his face. I pulled exactly $4 million in liquid cash, but it is not gone. I promise you the money is not gone. I did not gamble it away. I paid off my debts and I took the rest of it, the vast majority of it, and I put it into a guaranteed, highly exclusive real estate development project. Darius felt a terrifying, white-hot rage completely consume his mind. He lunged across the room, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Terrence violently by the collar of his suit jacket, lifting him entirely off his feet and slamming him brutally against the heavy mahogany door. Terrence let out a strangled cough as Darius's forearm pressed dangerously against his windpipe. Where is the money, Terrence? Darius roared, his face inches from his brother-in-law's terrified eyes. You stole the last remaining assets this family possessed. You took $4 million of our blood and our history. Where exactly did you put it? Give me the name of the development firm right now so I can liquidate those shares and get my money back. It is a sure thing. Terrence choked out, gasping for air as he frantically reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. It is the most lucrative explosive commercial development in the entire South. The property values are tripling overnight. We just have to go down there and claim the initial dividend payout. The returns are scheduled for this week. Terrence managed to pull a thick, glossy, high-end prospectus brochure from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it. He thrust it toward Darius's chest. It is a massive heritage restoration and luxury commercial district. Terrence gasped, his face turning a deep shade of purple from lack of oxygen. It is fully funded, fully permitted, and completely exclusive. Look at the brochure, Darius. Just look at the financials. It will save us. It will save all of us. Darius snatched the glossy brochure from Terrence's shaking hand. He abruptly let go of the collar, letting Terrence collapse onto the floor in a coughing, wheezing heap. Darius smoothed out the expensive, heavy cardstock of the brochure. His hands were trembling. His breathing was ragged. He needed a lifeline. He needed one single thread of hope to pull his family out of the absolute ruin they were currently drowning in. If this investment was real, if he could quickly liquidate the shares and recoup the $4 million, he could hire a ruthless legal team. He could fight Maya in court. He could regain a fraction of his dignity and keep his mother from living on the street. He looked down at the front cover of the brochure. The background was a stunning high-definition architectural rendering of a massive multi-million-dollar luxury waterfront district. Sleek modern buildings blended flawlessly with historic restored Southern architecture. Elegant boardwalks wrapped around pristine waterways. Embossed in heavy reflective gold lettering across the top of the page was the name of the project. Crescent Heritage, Luxury Development, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Darius felt a strange cold prickle at the base of his neck. Baton Rouge, the very heart of the swamp. The exact location he had spent 10 years mocking at high society dinner parties. He slowly lowered his gaze to the bottom half of the glossy page. There, occupying a prominent full-page feature, was a professional high-resolution photograph of the project's visionary founder and ultimate chief executive officer. The woman in the photograph was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal power suit. She stood confidently in front of a sprawling construction site, her arms crossed, her posture radiating absolute, undeniable dominance. Her eyes stared directly into the camera lens with a look of ruthless, predatory intelligence. It was Maya Jackson. Darius stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to solid ice. The glossy brochure slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering slowly to the floor and landing face up on the carpet. Vivian, finally catching her breath, stumbled forward and looked down at the brochure lying at her son's feet. Her eyes scanned the gold lettering, the architectural renderings, and finally the face of the CEO. Vivian let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a dying, rattling gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. Terrence had not invested the stolen Pierce money into a random corporate firm. He had unknowingly handed the last remaining $4 million of their generational wealth directly to Maya Jackson. She did not just own their logistics company. She now legally possessed the stolen equity from their summer home and Jada's trust fund. Maya had completely, utterly, and systematically consumed every single facet of their existence. And if the arrogant, broken, and destitute Pierce family ever wanted to see a single dime of that money again, they were going to have to travel directly to Baton Rouge. They were going to have to humble themselves, stand in the mud of the very swamp they had endlessly ridiculed, and beg Maya Jackson for mercy. 72 hours later, the oppressive, suffocating humidity of a Louisiana evening clung to the Pierce family like a damp, heavy shroud. They stood frozen at the entrance of the Louverture estate, a sprawling, breathtaking 300-acre property on the outskirts of Baton Rouge. For over a century, this land had been a site of deep historical pain, a traditional Southern plantation built on the broken backs of the subjugated. But it had long since been reclaimed. Maya's grandfather had purchased the entire estate through a blind trust decades ago. He had completely leveled the original master's quarters and funded the construction of a magnificent state-of-the-art architectural marvel, transferring the deed to a wealthy private Black historical society. Tonight, the estate was not a monument to oppression, but a brilliantly illuminated fortress of absolute Black excellence. The Pierces looked like absolute garbage. Their desperate, frantic journey from Atlanta had stripped them of their flawless, carefully curated armor. They had been forced to fly commercial sitting in cramped economy seats because every single one of their platinum corporate cards had been declined at the private charter terminal. The brutal Louisiana humidity had completely ruined Jada's expensive silk wrap, leaving her hair frizzy and her face shining with nervous, sticky sweat. Terrence was trembling so violently his teeth were practically chattering, his eyes darting around the magnificent grounds with the frantic energy of a cornered rat. Darius walked like a reanimated corpse. His custom-tailored suit was deeply wrinkled, his tie was missing, and the hollow, dead expression in his eyes revealed a man whose entire universe had been violently deleted. And then there was Vivian. Despite being completely bankrupt, despite wearing the same clothes she had worn for 2 days, Vivian Pierce still stubbornly clung to her suffocating arrogance. Her jaw was set in a rigid, furious line, and she marched up the crushed limestone driveway as if she still owned the world, completely oblivious to the sheer scale of the wealth surrounding her. They pushed past the massive mahogany front doors and stumbled directly into the Crescent Heritage Cultural Gala. The sheer, overwhelming opulence of the room stopped Darius dead in his tracks. This was not the flashy, loud new money display of the Atlanta country clubs the Pierces worshipped. This was old, quiet, earth-shattering wealth. The grand ballroom was bathed in the warm, golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, the smooth notes floating over a crowd of the true Southern elite. There were federal circuit judges, renowned chiefs of surgery, quiet political power brokers, and families whose land deeds predated the Civil War. Women wore custom couture and diamonds that did not scream for attention, but demanded absolute respect. Men in impeccable tuxedos stood with the relaxed, unbothered posture of people who controlled entire industries. At the very center of the room, standing at a beautifully carved mahogany podium, was Maya. She looked like a conquering goddess. She was draped in a breathtaking custom emerald silk gown that moved around her like liquid glass, highlighting the rich, flawless tone of her skin. The submissive, quiet, uneducated girl who used to wear the conservative, boring clothes Darius picked out for her was completely gone. In her place stood a corporate titan radiating a terrifying magnetic power. She was currently delivering a graceful, articulate speech about the Crescent Heritage Development, detailing the multi-billion-dollar endowment her family had just established to fund minority-owned commercial enterprises across the South. Just beyond the grand French doors, playing happily in the safely enclosed manicured courtyard, were her children. They were beautiful, radiant 5-year-old twins she had quietly adopted through her family's private agency years ago. She had kept them safely hidden in Louisiana, far away from the toxic, classist, and endlessly judgmental scrutiny of the Pierce family. Now they were laughing and running through the grass, completely enveloped in the fierce, protective love of Maya's massive extended family. They were safe. They were home. Darius stared at Maya, his heart physically aching as the absolute reality of his monumental stupidity finally settled into his bones. He had possessed a queen, and he had treated her like a peasant. But Vivian Pierce did not see a queen. Vivian only saw the woman she had spent a decade treating like disposable garbage. Vivian saw the woman who had just stolen her historic summer home and ruined her flawless dynasty. "I do not believe this," Vivian hissed, her voice vibrating with a toxic, unhinged fury. "Look at her parading around like she belongs here. Vivian, do not do this." Darius rasped, his voice sounding like dry gravel. His hand reached out feebly to stop his mother, but he was entirely too late. Vivian marched straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. She shoved past a decorated Supreme Court justice and nearly knocked a tray of champagne flutes out of a waiter's hands. Jada and Terrence scrambled after her like terrified ducklings, desperate to hide behind the matriarch's misplaced bravado. "Maya Jackson." Vivian shrieked, her voice cutting through the elegant jazz music and silencing the entire ballroom instantly. The music ground to a jarring halt. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the South slowly turned their heads, staring at the disheveled, frantic woman, screaming in the middle of their exclusive gala. The security detail immediately stepped forward from the shadows, their hands moving to their earpieces, but Maya simply raised a single, graceful, emerald-clad arm. The guards stopped instantly, backing away but keeping their eyes locked on the intruders. Maya did not flinch. She did not look surprised. She slowly leaned forward against the mahogany podium, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her flawless face. "Well," Maya said, her voice echoing through the high-definition sound system, smooth and deadly as a velvet garrote. "Ladies and gentlemen, it appears we have some uninvited entertainment for the evening. Please excuse the interruption." Vivian marched all the way to the front of the room, stopping just below the elevated stage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Maya's face. "You step down from that podium right this second," Vivian demanded, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. "I do not care what kind of little costume party you are throwing down here in this miserable swamp. You are a thief. You manipulated my idiot son-in-law, you forged documents, and you stole our family's money. I demand that you return our funds immediately, or I will have you arrested before this ridiculous party is over." A collective, quiet gasp rippled through the elegant crowd. Not a gasp of fear, but a gasp of sheer, absolute second-hand embarrassment. A highly respected neurosurgeon standing near the front row actually covered her mouth to hide a laugh, staring at Vivian, as if she were a woman who had completely lost her mind. Jada grabbed her mother's arm, suddenly hyper-aware of the incredibly powerful, unbothered eyes staring them down. "Mom, stop it," Jada whispered frantically, realizing with terrifying clarity that they were entirely out of their depth. "Everyone is staring at us." "Let them stare," Vivian roared, shaking off Jada's hand. "I want our $4 million back right now, Maya. You drain that fraudulent account and wire our money back to the Pierce Trust, and maybe, just maybe, I will not press federal charges." Maya looked down at Vivian for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the ballroom was so profound, you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. Maya slowly picked up her crystal glass, took a delicate sip of sparkling water, and then stepped out from behind the podium. She walked down the short flight of stairs, her emerald gown trailing behind her until she was standing eye to eye with her former mother-in-law. "You came all the way down to my swamp, Vivian," Maya said softly, her voice carrying a lethal, terrifying calm. "And you forgot to wipe your feet. You insolent little trash." Vivian spat, stepping forward aggressively. "Do you know who I am? I am Vivian Pierce. We built Atlanta. We own the logistics market. You are nothing but a charity case Darius picked up out of the mud. Now give us our money." Maya let out a short melodic laugh that sent a violent shiver straight down Terrence's spine. She turned her head slightly, acknowledging Terrence, who was currently trying to shrink behind Jada's shoulder. "Your pathetic gambling-addicted son-in-law came to my corporate development firm begging for a bailout," Maya stated, projecting her voice so the entire ballroom could hear the absolute humiliation of the Pierce family. "Terrence forged your signatures, Vivian. Terrence mortgaged your precious historic summer home because he owed millions to underground bookies in Buckhead. I did not steal your money. My firm purchased your deeply toxic, rapidly defaulting debt. We legally acquired the deed to your summer home because your family is completely functionally bankrupt." Vivian's face turned a horrifying shade of pale gray. She looked back at Terrence, who visibly whimpered and averted his eyes. "And as for your $4 million, Vivian," Maya continued, stepping even closer, her eyes flashing with absolute dominance. "You demand it back as if it is a fortune, as if $4 million is a sum of money that actually matters in this room." Maya gestured gracefully to the crowd surrounding them. The floral budget for this evening's gala was $500,000. Maya whispered her words, striking Vivian like physical blows. "The endowment my family just signed over to the Historic Society this morning was $2.5 billion. Your $4 million is pocket change, Vivian. It is an accounting rounding error. You paraded around for a decade acting like you were royalty, looking down your surgically enhanced nose at me because you thought my family was poor. You thought you held the keys to the kingdom. Maya leaned in, her voice, dropping to a deadly icy whisper meant only for the ruined family standing before her. But you never owned the kingdom, Vivian. You were just renting a very small, very fragile castle, and your lease has officially expired. Jada let out a small, pathetic sob, her hands coming up to cover her face, as the utter reality of their destruction finally set in. Terence was openly weeping now, his chest heaving, as the elite crowd watched their public execution with cold, impassive stares. Darius finally stepped forward. His legs felt like lead. He moved past his trembling mother and his sobbing sister, stopping just a few feet away from the woman he had completely taken for granted. He looked at Maya, truly looking at her for the first time in his life. He saw the power, the intelligence, and the absolute unyielding strength that had been hiding right in front of his face for years. Maya! Darius choked out, his voice breaking under the crushing weight of his monumental regret. Please, I am begging you. The company, the house. My mother has nowhere to go. Terence destroyed us, but you do not have to do this. You won. You completely won. Just give us a fraction of the equity back. Just enough to survive. Please. Maya looked at the broken, begging man who had once demanded her total submission. She looked at the man who had brought a pregnant mistress into her home and demanded she sign away her rights. There was absolutely no pity in her eyes. There was no lingering affection. There was only the cold, clinical assessment of a CEO looking at a bad investment. You asked for a divorce, Darius, Maya said smoothly, her voice ringing with finality. You demanded I sign the papers. You wanted me out of your life so you could build your legacy with your secretary. I simply gave you exactly what you asked for. Maya turned her back on Darius, her emerald gown sweeping gracefully across the floor. She looked over at the head of her security detail and gave a single dismissive nod. Escort the Pierce family off my property, Maya ordered, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. And if they ever attempt to trespass in Baton Rouge again, have them arrested. Security guards in tailored suits immediately converged on the family, grabbing Terence roughly by the arms and firmly directing Jada and Vivian toward the exit. Vivian tried to scream, tried to fight back, but her voice failed her. The sheer overwhelming humiliation had finally broken her mind. Darius did not fight the guards. He let them turn him around, his eyes remaining locked on Maya as she walked back up the stairs to the podium, seamlessly resuming her place at the center of the elite society she ruled. The heavy mahogany doors of the Louverture estate slammed shut behind him, sealing the Pierce family outside in the dark, suffocating mud of the Louisiana swamp, leaving them with absolutely nothing but the crushing, inescapable consequences of their own boundless arrogance. Arthur Sterling watched Darius with clinical detachment, waiting for the reality of total financial ruin to finally penetrate the man's shattered ego. Before Arthur could instruct security to begin the eviction process, the heavy frosted glass doors of the executive suite violently crashed open. The thick mahogany rebounded off the metal doorstops with a sharp, explosive crack that jolted Darius from his catatonic paralysis. Jada stormed into the room like a localized hurricane. Her usually immaculate silk blouse was torn at the shoulder, her perfectly coiffed hair was a wild, frantic mess, and her eyes were burning with a manic, unhinged fury. Right behind her, stumbling and frantically trying to adjust his ruined bespoke collar, was Terence. His cheek still bore the bright, angry red imprint of Jada's vicious slap. "Arthur, freeze his access right this second!" Jada shrieked. She marched directly toward the mahogany conference table, completely ignoring her mother weeping on the floor and her brother staring blankly into space. "I want this parasitic rat cut off from everything. Cancel his corporate cards, lock him out of the brokerage accounts, and revoke his clearance to the Pierce Family Trust. He is dead to this family." Arthur Sterling did not even blink. He calmly adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and looked at Jada with the same cold, clinical detachment he had just directed at her mother. "I cannot freeze his access, Jada," Arthur stated evenly. "Do not tell me what you cannot do." Jada roared, slamming her manicured hands onto the polished wood. "I am a Pierce. My father built this firm's portfolio. You work for us. Freeze his accounts or I will have you fired by the end of the day." Arthur let out a slow, deeply exhausted breath. You clearly have not been briefed on the morning's developments, Jada. I cannot freeze your husband's access because there are absolutely no accounts left to freeze. The Pierce family trust is officially dissolved. Your corporate allowances have been permanently terminated. Maya Jackson executed a total asset liquidation an hour ago. Every single one of you is completely unequivocally bankrupt. Jada froze. The manic, furious energy instantly drained from her body, leaving her completely rigid. She looked at Arthur, then slowly turned her head to look at her mother, who was still curled on the carpet, clutching her broken pearl necklace. She looked at Darius, whose face was the color of wet ash. Bankrupt. Jada whispered the word, sounding entirely foreign on her tongue. What do you mean, bankrupt? Maya is just a housewife. She does not have the authority to touch our money. She was your majority shareholder, Arthur corrected sharply. And she just pulled the plug on your entire existence. You have nothing left, Jada. None of you do. Terrence had been hovering nervously near the doorway, catching his breath and preparing to weather another storm of Jada's verbal abuse. But the moment Arthur's words registered in his brain, a profound, suffocating terror washed over him. The blood completely drained from his face. His knees visibly buckled, and he had to grab the heavy brass door handle just to keep himself standing. If the Pierce money was gone, his safety net was gone. If the Pierce money was gone, the massive gaping hole he had secretly dug in their finances was about to be exposed to the light of day. There was no way to hide it anymore. The walls were rapidly closing in on him, and the panic completely hijacked his nervous system. No, Terrence gasped, his voice cracking hysterically. No, 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 that cannot be right. The trust cannot be gone. The equity deals. The safety margins. Darius, tell him he is lying. Darius, you promised me the family accounts were untouchable. You told me there was always a slush fund. Darius slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot and his vision was swimming with absolute rage. He glared at the man who had slept with his mistress, the man who had just shattered his sister's life, the man who was now whining about slush funds while their entire dynasty burned to the ground. You pathetic, sniveling coward! Darius growled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You impregnate the woman carrying my supposed heir. You humiliate my sister, and your first thought is whether you can still leech off my family's money. I am going to end you, Terrence. Terrence backed away, his hands flying up defensively. You do not understand, Darius. You do not understand what is at stake here. I owe people money. Serious, dangerous people. Jada snapped her head toward her husband, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, lethal slits. What are you talking about, Terrence? What people? I had gambling debts. Terrence blurted out the words tumbling from his mouth in a frantic, desperate rush. I had massive losses at the underground tables in Buckhead. They were threatening to break my legs. They were threatening to come to the house. And then Chloe. Chloe started demanding more. You thought you were financing her luxury condo, Darius, but she wanted more than that. She wanted designer bags, expensive trips, jewelry. She threatened to tell Jada about us if I did not keep her happy. I was drowning. I was completely tapped out. Vivian slowly pushed herself up from the floor, her makeup smeared across her cheeks. You are a broke, talentless fraud. Vivian spat venomously. You never had a dime to your name before you married my daughter. How exactly did you plan to pay off illegal gambling debts and a greedy mistress? Terrence swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if searching for an exit that did not exist. I needed capital. He stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. I needed a massive cash injection to get the debt collectors off my back and to make a singular foolproof investment that would triple my money. I just needed a bridge loan. I was going to pay it back. I swear to God I was going to pay every single cent back before the quarterly audits. Where did you get the capital, Terrence? Darius demanded, stepping away from the table, his physical presence looming over the smaller man. Terrence squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the impact. I used my legal clearance as Jada's husband. I mortgaged her remaining independent trust fund. And I forged your signatures to take out a massive high-interest equity loan against the Martha's Vineyard summer estate. A horrifying, deadly silence fell over the executive office. Jada let out a choked gasp, stumbling backward until her spine hit the glass wall. Her independent trust fund was the only money her father had legally separated from the primary corporate accounts. It was her personal safety net. It was the money she used to fund her charities, her social events, and her entire identity. Vivian let out a sharp, agonizing wail. The Martha's Vineyard estate was a historic, sprawling oceanfront property that had been in the Pierce family for 4 generations. It was the ultimate symbol of their old money status, the crown jewel of their social supremacy. "You mortgaged my family's legacy," Vivian shrieked, launching herself at Terrence with surprising speed. "You stole my sanctuary. You gave our history to a bank." Arthur caught Vivian by the arm, gently but firmly restraining the older woman before she could physically assault Terrence. "It was $4 million. Terrence cried out, holding his hands up to shield his face. "I pulled exactly $4 million in liquid cash. But it is not gone. I promise you the money is not gone. I did not gamble it away. I paid off my debts, and I took the rest of it. The vast majority of it, and I put it into a guaranteed, highly exclusive real estate development project." Darius felt a terrifying, white-hot rage completely consume his mind. He lunged across the room, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Terrence violently by the collar of his suit jacket, lifting him entirely off his feet and slamming him brutally against the heavy mahogany door. Terrence let out a strangled cough as Darius's forearm pressed dangerously against his windpipe. "Where is the money, Terrence?" Darius roared, his face inches from his brother-in-law's terrified eyes. "You stole the last remaining assets this family possessed. You took $4 million of our blood and our history. Where exactly did you put it? Give me the name of the development firm right now so I can liquidate those shares and get my money back." "It is a sure thing." Terrence choked out, gasping for air, as he frantically reached into the inner pocket of his ruined suit jacket. "It is the most lucrative explosive commercial development in the entire South. The property values are tripling overnight. We just have to go down there and claim the initial dividend payout. The returns are scheduled for this week." Terrence managed to pull a thick, glossy, high-end prospectus brochure from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped it. He thrust it toward Darius's chest. "It is a massive heritage restoration and luxury commercial district." Terrence gasped, his face turning a deep shade of purple from lack of oxygen. "It is fully funded, fully permitted, and completely exclusive. Look at the brochure, Darius. Just look at the financials. It will save us. It will save all of us." Darius snatched the glossy brochure from Terrence's shaking hand. He abruptly let go of the collar, letting Terrence collapse onto the floor in a coughing, wheezing heap. Darius smoothed out the expensive, heavy cardstock of the brochure. His hands were trembling. His breathing was ragged. He needed a lifeline. He needed one single thread of hope to pull his family out of the absolute ruin they were currently drowning in. If this investment was real, if he could quickly liquidate the shares and recoup the $4 million, he could hire a ruthless legal team. He could fight Maya in court. He could regain a fraction of his dignity and keep his mother from living on the street. He looked down at the front cover of the brochure. The background was a stunning, high-definition architectural rendering of a massive multi-million-dollar luxury waterfront district. Sleek modern buildings blended flawlessly with historic, restored Southern architecture. Elegant boardwalks wrapped around pristine waterways. Embossed in heavy, reflective gold lettering across the top of the page was the name of the project: Crescent Heritage Luxury Development, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Darius felt a strange cold prickle at the base of his neck. Baton Rouge, the very heart of the swamp. The exact location he had spent 10 years mocking at high society dinner parties. He slowly lowered his gaze to the bottom half of the glossy page. There, occupying a prominent full-page feature, was a professional, high-resolution photograph of the project's visionary founder and ultimate chief executive officer. The woman in the photograph was wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal power suit. She stood confidently in front of a sprawling construction site, her arms crossed, her posture radiating absolute, undeniable dominance. Her eyes stared directly into the camera lens with a look of ruthless, predatory intelligence. It was Maya Jackson. Darius stopped breathing. The air in his lungs turned to solid ice. The glossy brochure slipped from his trembling fingers, fluttering slowly to the floor and landing face up on the carpet. Vivian, finally catching her breath, stumbled forward and looked down at the brochure lying at her son's feet. Her eyes scanned the gold lettering, the architectural renderings, and finally the face of the CEO. Vivian let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of a dying, rattling gasp. She covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. Terrence had not invested the stolen Pierce money into a random corporate firm. He had unknowingly handed the last remaining $4 million of their generational wealth directly to Maya Jackson. She did not just own their logistics company. She now legally possessed the stolen equity from their summer home and Jada's trust fund. Maya had completely, utterly, and systematically consumed every single facet of their existence. And if the arrogant, broken, and destitute Pierce family ever wanted to see a single dime of that money again, they were going to have to travel directly to Baton Rouge. They were going to have to humble themselves, stand in the mud of the very swamp they had endlessly ridiculed, and beg Maya Jackson for mercy. The heavy mahogany doors of the Louverture estate had barely clicked shut, sealing the Pierce family outside in the dark, suffocating mud of the Louisiana swamp, when the heavy brass handles violently turned again. The doors swung wide open with a heavy, atmospheric groan. The security guards who had just marched them out stood frozen on the limestone driveway, their earpieces suddenly buzzing with a new, overriding directive. Maya's voice echoed through the external security speakers, smooth, amplified, and dripping with lethal intent. "Wait, bring them back inside." Darius felt a sudden, desperate surge of hope ignite in his chest. His mother, Vivian, immediately straightened her ruined spine, a triumphant, sickening smirk instantly reappearing on her face. She adjusted her wrinkled designer jacket, thoroughly convinced that Maya had panicked. Vivian believed Maya had finally realized the sheer unmitigated disaster of crossing the Pierce dynasty and was now begging for a private negotiation. Jada sniffled, wiping her smeared mascara, while Terrence let out a massive, shaky breath of relief. They turned around and marched back into the grand ballroom, their arrogant postures returning entirely blind to the fact that they were not walking toward a truce. They were walking to a public execution. The security guards did not direct them toward a private executive suite. Instead, they forced the Pierce family to march straight down the center aisle of the ballroom, right through the sea of the Southern elite. The jazz music remained dead silent. The hundreds of billionaires, federal judges, and political titans simply stared, their eyes cold, evaluating and dissecting. The crowd parted seamlessly, giving them a wide, humiliating berth, treating the formerly untouchable Atlanta royalty like a highly contagious disease. Maya stood flawlessly at the carved mahogany podium. She did not call security to throw them out again. Instead, she gestured gracefully with her emerald-clad arm, inviting them to step right up to the front of the stage. The massive high-definition projector screen behind her, originally intended to display the architectural renderings of her charity foundation, suddenly flickered to life. Maya tapped a sleek silver remote. The screen illuminated the entire ballroom with crisp, undeniable, high-resolution legal documents. The collective breath of the room hitched, as the paperwork was magnified for every single titan of industry to read. There were bank transfer authorizations heavily redacted, but clear enough to show the exact routing numbers. There were the mortgage deeds to the Pierce family's historic Martha's Vineyard estate, and at the very bottom of the screen, blown up to a massive size, were the frantic, sloppy signatures of Terrence Washington. "You want to discuss your $4 million, Vivian?" Maya asked, her voice echoing perfectly through the pristine acoustics of the ballroom. "You want to accuse me of theft in front of my esteemed guests? Let us review the receipts. I believe in absolute crystalline transparency." Maya pressed another button. The screen transitioned to a side-by-side display. On the left was the fraudulent equity loan Terrence had secured by forging his mother-in-law's signature. On the right was the direct wire transfer he had made to Crescent Heritage Luxury Development, The dates matched perfectly. The amounts matched down to the very last cent. $4 million liquidated from a protected trust transferred through 3 shell companies and deposited directly into the Crescent Heritage Expansion Fund. Maya narrated, stepping out from behind the podium so the entire room could see her. Your legacy did not disappear into thin air, Vivian. It bought the concrete we are currently standing on. My firm does not steal. We acquire. We conquer. And occasionally, we accept the desperately stupid investments of men who are actively drowning in their own filth. Maya paused, letting the crushing reality of the financial documents settle over the room. The absolute silence was deafening. "Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mr. Terrence Washington," Maya announced, her voice rising with undeniable power. Maya gestured grandly toward Terrence. The small man immediately recoiled, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows, staring down at his own grave. The elite crowd stared at him, their expressions hardening into absolute disgust. Thanks to his desperate need to fund his mistress, Maya continued delivering the final fatal strike. A mistress who is currently carrying his child while aggressively claiming that the baby belonged to my ex-husband. Because of that brilliant, expensive little secret, our preservation society acquired the Pierce estate for pennies on the dollar. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the ballroom. The scandal was so profoundly toxic, so incredibly filthy, that even the most seasoned, unshakable billionaires in the room recoiled in pure shock. The whispers ignited instantly, a vicious, buzzing hive of high society gossip that would permanently destroy the Pierce name in every boardroom across the country. Jada Pierce stopped breathing. The words hit her physical body like a speeding freight train. She slowly turned her head, staring at Terrence, her husband, the man she had defended, funded, and protected. He had mortgaged her independent trust fund. He had gambled away her future. And he had done it to pay off Chloe. He had slept with her brother's mistress, impregnated her, and stood by silently while Darius destroyed his entire marriage to Maya over a baby that belonged to Terrence. Jada's legs completely gave out. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, her expensive designer dress crumpling around her. A raw, agonizing wail tore from her throat. It was not a delicate upper-class cry. It was the brutal, guttural scream of a woman whose entire reality had just been violently ripped apart. She broke down, weeping uncontrollably in front of the most powerful people in the South, clutching her stomach as she gasped for air, her tears leaving dark, wet stains on the pristine wood. Terrence panicked. He lunged forward, his hands reaching out to grab her shaking shoulders. "Jada, baby, please do not listen to her. I can explain. It was a mistake. Get away from me!" Jada shrieked, scrambling backward across the floor like a terrified animal trying to escape a predator. She slapped his hands away, her perfectly manicured nails catching his cheek and drawing a fresh line of blood. "Do not ever touch me again. You absolute monster. You sick, repulsive monster." Darius stood completely paralyzed. His brain misfired, desperately trying to process the magnitude of the revelation. Chloe was not carrying his child. There was no Pierce heir. He had divorced Maya, he had shattered his life, he had subjected himself to public ruin, all for a child that belonged to the sniveling, pathetic coward standing right next to him. A dark, terrifying shadow began to swarm at the edges of his vision. He wanted to kill Terrence. He wanted to wrap his hands around his brother-in-law's throat and squeeze until the life left his eyes. But his body would not move. He was entirely trapped in a nightmare of his own making, suffocating under the weight of his own colossal failures. Vivian Pierce, however, did not freeze. The sound of her daughter wailing on the floor, the sight of her family's most humiliating secrets being projected on a massive screen, and the cold, judgmental stares of the Southern elite completely shattered her fragile grip on reality. The untouchable matriarch of Atlanta logistics lost her mind entirely. Her face contorted into a mask of pure demonic rage. She let out a feral, unhinged scream and charged up the short flight of stairs toward the podium. She did not care about the security guards stepping forward from the shadows. She did not care about the federal judges watching her public meltdown. She only wanted to destroy the woman who had stripped her of her crown. "You little swamp trash!" Vivian roared, closing the distance in an instant. She raised her hand high into the air, putting the entire weight of her body into a vicious full-force slap aimed directly at Maya's face. Maya did not flinch. She did not step back. She did not call for help. With lightning speed and effortless precision, Maya raised her arm and caught Vivian's wrist mid-air. The loud, sharp smack of flesh hitting flesh echoed through the microphone, but it was not Maya's cheek that took the hit. It was Maya's hand closing like an iron vice around Vivian's forearm. Vivian gasped in shock, her momentum coming to a jarring, violent halt. She tried to yank her arm away, pulling with all her might, but Maya's grip was absolute. Maya did not just hold her. She twisted Vivian's wrist ever so slightly, applying a sharp, agonizing pressure that forced the older woman to bend her knees just to avoid snapping her own bones. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was absolute, deafening, and electric. Maya stared down at Vivian. The fire in Maya's eyes was not hot and chaotic. It was cold, deep, and ancient. It was the look of a woman standing on land her ancestors had bled on, a woman who now owned the earth beneath her feet. She leaned in close, the microphone picking up every single syllable of her icy, devastating verdict. "You do not have the clearance to touch me, Vivian." Maya stated, her voice a low, terrifying rumble that shook the crystal glasses on the tables. "You do not even have the clearance to stand on my floors." Maya abruptly released Vivian's wrist, shoving her backward with a flick of her hand. Vivian stumbled down the stairs, her expensive heels catching on the carpet, sending her sprawling onto her hands and knees right next to her sobbing daughter. Vivian hit the floor hard, her carefully maintained dignity shattering into a million irreparable pieces. Maya smoothed the silk of her emerald gown, completely unbothered, her breathing perfectly even. She looked down at the ruined, broken pieces of the Pierce dynasty scattered at the foot of her stage. She looked at Terence, who was currently cowering away from his hysterical wife. She looked at Vivian, who was staring at her own shaking hands in absolute disbelief. And finally, Maya looked at Darius, the man who had promised to protect her, only to discard her the moment he thought he had found something better. Darius met her gaze, his eyes shining with unshed tears, silently begging for a mercy he knew he did not deserve. Maya gave him nothing. She turned her gaze back to the head of her security detail, who was already stepping forward. "Remove them," Maya ordered, her voice devoid of any emotion. "They are contaminating the air." The heavily built security guards moved in unison, their large hands reaching out to grab Darius by the shoulders and physically drag him out of the pristine ballroom. Their faces were set in stone, fully prepared to toss the ruined remains of the Pierce family into the humid Louisiana night. Maya had given the order. The execution was supposed to be completely final. But as the first guard's fingers clamped down on his wrinkled suit jacket, Darius froze. He did not pull away. He did not struggle or beg or plead for mercy the way he had just seconds before. Instead, his shoulders began to shake. The trembling moved up his neck, vibrating through his jaw until a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. It was a chuckle. The sound was so incredibly out of place, so entirely discordant with the absolute devastation surrounding him, that the security guards instinctively hesitated, glancing up at Maya for confirmation. The low chuckle rapidly bubbled up from Darius's chest, twisting and morphing into a loud, booming, venomous laugh that bounced harshly off the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom. It was a manic, unhinged sound. It was the laugh of a cornered predator who had just remembered his teeth were still sharp. Darius threw his head back, his laughter echoing over the hundreds of silent, horrified elite guests. The Federal Circuit judges, the old money patriarchs, and the surgical chiefs stared at him with mounting unease. They had just watched this man lose his entire generational fortune, his dignity, and his marriage. They expected him to crawl away in shame. They did not expect him to stand his ground and laugh in the face of his executioner. "Stop!" Darius gasped, holding up a single hand to the security guards while using the other to wipe a bead of sweat from his forehead. "You do not want to touch me right now. I highly recommend you take your hands off my suit before this entire spectacular charity masquerade burns to the ground." The guards did not move until Maya, her eyes narrowing imperceptibly, gave a microscopic flick of her wrist. The men stepped back, creating a tight, tense perimeter around the laughing man, allowing him just enough space to breathe. Darius slowly straightened his spine. He rolled his shoulders, the manic energy flooding his veins and completely replacing the suffocating despair that had paralyzed him moments ago. He looked down at his mother Vivian, who was still kneeling on the hardwood floor in a state of catatonic shock. He looked at his sister Jada, whose tear-streaked face was a messy, ruined mask of confusion. And finally he locked eyes with Maya. He stepped forward, completely ignoring the guards, closing the distance until he was standing at the very base of her elevated stage. "You really thought you had it all figured out, did you not, Maya?" Darius sneered, his voice dripping with a toxic, condescending arrogance that felt entirely familiar to the woman standing above him. "You really thought you could come down here to this miserable mosquito-infested swamp throw on a shiny green dress and play the role of the untouchable corporate titan? You thought you could completely dismantle my family publicly, humiliate my mother, and kick me out into the street like a stray dog?" Darius reached his hand into the inner breast pocket of his ruined, custom-tailored suit. The security guards immediately tensed, dropping into defensive stances, their hands hovering dangerously close to their concealed weapons. They thought he was reaching for a gun. They thought the broken man had finally snapped and decided to turn the public execution into a bloodbath. But Darius did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a thick, heavy, neatly folded legal document. The premium cream-colored paper was bound by a heavy brass staple and the official embossed seal of a major federal banking institution,